This is All Things Secured. My name's Josh. I'm joined by Kee Jeffreys. He's the technical co-founder of Session, and we're here to talk about encrypted messaging services. And this live stream is brought to you by DeleteMe. Learn how you can get rid of your information online quick, easily, and safely using DeleteMe at joindeleteme.com/allthingssecured. Kee, I'd like to start off by asking you this. With this month, there was recent news about how the RCS protocol, which is what I think Google used to use for encrypted messaging and a lot of other rich features in their texting, is now going to have cross-platform compatibility with Apple users. So now the Apple and Google can communicate encrypted with encrypted messages. With all of that, what is the value of having an encrypted messaging service like Session?
Yeah, so I think that's been a very interesting development. Is like, Apple was not initially very happy about having to, support RCS. I think the EU's pushed them a bit more towards having to open up their messaging systems. They have this Digital Services Act or Digital Markets Act, which kind of enforces certain messaging applications and platforms to open up a bit more. So I think that's been a bit of push on their side. But RCS really only focuses on the encryption of messages themselves and the data that's going between the messaging clients. So you're sending a message on Android or you're sending a message on iMessage through their native systems. It's handling the encryption between those two devices. What it doesn't focus on, though, is the metadata involved in a conversation. So when you send a message using a phone number, your phone number is attached to that message. And your phone number is also attached to a bunch of real world identifiers. So you may have signed up for a bunch of accounts with that phone number. You may use that phone number on a public listing for your business. You may connect that phone number to your person in some way. Like when you sign up, you may give the phone number provider like your identity or your address to be able to bill you properly. So there's all of this metadata which is associated with phone numbers, which then can be used to link individuals together. So if one phone number sends a message to another phone number and you know the identities behind those phone numbers, then it's clear who's talking, when they're talking, because there's a central server involved in the relay of those messages from one user to another. So you end up getting a lot of metadata about the conversation, even though you may not get the contents of that conversation. Where the more advanced encrypted messaging applications come in, like Session or Signal, is that like we're actually trying to hide the metadata of the conversation as well. So if you look at Session, for example, it doesn't require a phone number to sign up, which immediately removes that part of metadata. It just generates this unique account ID, which is a long string of numbers and letters, which is generated when you sign up. It's not linked to your real world identity in any way. And then it also hides your IP address on the network as well. So, when you're talking to that server to send it messages, you're actually hopping through 3 different nodes to obscure your IP address, similar to a VPN.
Yeah.
So in that way, like there's a lot of technology which goes into messengers, which is not just about the encryption of contents. It's also about the hiding of metadata as well. So I would say like that's probably one of the key points where Session kind of deviates from something like RCS and why it's needed, even though RCS exists.
Yeah. Okay, I think that makes sense. So, like, especially when we're using like something like WhatsApp or Messenger, where I do see the marketing that says, "Hey, we're end-to-end encrypted," and I assume that they're not lying about that. But at the same time, they also like because you had to create an account with Facebook in order to use those services, they can track at least who you're communicating with. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, exactly. And WhatsApp is an interesting case as well because the code is actually closed source in
Okay.
WhatsApp. So they say that they use the Signal protocol, but it's actually very hard to verify that they're using the Signal protocol in the correct manner because you can't go and inspect the WhatsApp source code. Whereas something like Signal or Session, we're both open source, so people can come inspect the source code and actually see that the encryption methods that we're claiming to use are actually the encryption methods that are used. But yes, on the metadata point, there's a central server or several central servers that WhatsApp operates. And when you send a message, you're relaying that message through that centralized server. and so is the recipient who's fetching the message from that server. So there's immediately a link between either the Facebook account or the phone number associated with that account, and then the recipient who's receiving that message as well.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to kind of dig in a little bit more because like I said at the top of this whole thing, it feels like a very, very basic system. But can you walk us through like the flow of data in a traditional centralized messaging platform versus one that's decentralized? Like what happens? When is the data encrypted? All of that stuff.
Yeah, so I can talk about session in particular because every decentralized system is designed in a
Sure.
slightly different way. To start, like on the centralized messaging applications, ones that are end-to-end encrypted, so say WhatsApp, typically what's going to happen is when you start talking to a user, you're going to enter their phone number, and then you're going to go to the server and fetch their public key, their public encryption key. And maybe in the case of the Signal protocol, you fetch this like pre-key bundle, which is basically like some ephemeral encryption keys or fairly ephemeral encryption keys. You'll then on your device locally, you'll like compose a message and you'll click send. And then your message will be encrypted for that user's public key or ephemeral public key in the case of the Signal protocol. That message will then be sent to the WhatsApp server. And then the other user is typically going to go to the server every so often and retrieve the message and pull it down. Or they may have like a persistent connection open with the server and it kind of pushes it to them. And then with their public key, they have the public-private key pair. They're able to decrypt the message, which is for them. And then there's also like a key rotation process, which happens in the Signal protocol as well. So that's typically the way that the data flows in a centralized messaging application. In a decentralized messaging application, it's a bit different. So instead of having this initial resolution process, which happens between, say, a phone number and the user's public key, in session, the public key is directly used as the method to contact someone. So we have these account IDs, which are public keys themselves, which you send to someone, or they can scan a QR code. And then you'll be able to start composing a message for that user. The good thing there is instead of having a server which can actually lie to you about what the user's public key is, this is called a man-in-the-middle attack. It's like there needs to be this resolution between phone number and public key. The server can say, oh, this is the public key for that user and can be lying to you. So that's an attack that centralized messaging applications face that session doesn't because it actually requires the user's public key before you start messaging them, and that's shared out of band.
Okay.
So you'll then encrypt a message for that public key. Every user in the network also has a swarm, there's this network of 2,200 nodes, which is run by the community in session. Okay. And there's 320 swarms, which are basically collections of those nodes. So each swarm has around 5 to 7 nodes in it. And when you know someone's public key, you can also know the nodes in their swarm. So when you send a message to someone, you're encrypting it locally on your device, and then you're finding one of the nodes in their swarm and then sending it to that node. That node then replicates it amongst the other 7 nodes. So if one of those nodes goes offline, you don't lose the message. And then the user who's receiving the message comes online. They speak to one of the nodes in their swarm. They request the message comes back, and then they decrypt it. So it's quite a bit more complicated. Also, sorry, in the middle of that process, there's also onion routing as well. Yeah. So instead of talking directly to a node in the user's swarm, you actually create an onion route. So you choose 3 different nodes randomly from the network, and then you hop between those nodes before you deposit the message in that user's swarm. And then the same happens on the recipient side. So instead of talking directly to the node in their swarm that holds the messages for them, they actually do an onion route and request the message back to hide their IP address. So in the decentralized context, it's actually quite a bit more complicated. You're, communicating with fully end-to-end. You're usually communicating with through 8 different nodes before a message actually comes to you, because there's 3 nodes on one side, on the sending side, and then the node that's storing it, and then there's 3 nodes on the receiving side and the node that's storing it. So wow. Yeah, it's quite a bit of complexity, but offers a lot more kind of security and privacy guarantees.
does it slow, like, does that process slow the message down at all? I'm assuming it would in some way.
Yeah. So onion routing always has a latency overhead to traditional, just storing on a server and requesting from the server. The
Yeah.
reason being, and people would understand this from like using a VPN, you're adding an additional kind of hop
Yeah.
to the route. So instead of going directly to the server and requesting the message, now you have to go to server A, and then server A goes to the actual server that's storing your message, and then you hop backwards through as well. So you're adding a bit of latency there. Um, in session currently, the latency is around 1 to 2 seconds, which is not the best because most messaging applications are kind of, you send a message and it'll be sent within, maybe 40 to 50 milliseconds, depending on how close you are to the server. We are actually working on an upgrade to the onion routing protocol, which takes that latency way down. So we're hoping to get to the point where it's 300 to 400 milliseconds to retrieve a message and send a message. And that's much more tolerable from a user perspective. But yeah, there is always going to be an additional latency added when you add in more hops.
One of the questions that I had sent to you prior to this, conversation we're having now was like, what the difference is between, or is there a difference between onion and blockchain? And from the way you just described it, you're almost using both of those in tandem. Would that be a good way to describe that?
Yeah, so the way that Session uses blockchain is just as an incentivization layer for that network of 2,200 nodes.
Okay.
So if you go and download Session, like in the App Store or on Google Play, it's not forced like into your face. You don't actually need to know anything about blockchain. You don't need to have a wallet. You don't need to pay any fees, which is intentional because these things can be hard for people to cross the barrier of, like understanding blockchain or being able to have a cryptocurrency to pay for something. Like that's a big barrier to entry. So really, Session is using blockchain on the back end to incentivize that network of nodes. So essentially the way that works is if you run a node in the network, you receive a reward every block that's created for operating in the network and providing services to Session. So essentially providing the routing and storage services to users of Session. So it's kind of abstracted away from the user.
Okay. Well, if you're just joining us, my name's Josh. I am joined with Kee Jeffreys. He's the technical co-founder of Session. And we are talking about encrypted messaging. And now that you mention, talking about the blockchain and how they are compensated in I guess for the work that they do. One of the things that I'm curious about, especially when we talk about a free messaging service, we always say that if it's free, you should watch out because you more than likely are the product. So then when we're talking about something like Session, and I've even thought this about Signal and, others as well, what is the business model here that allows it to be free for the average person and for that not to be something that's worrisome to us?
Yeah, so the eventual idea of where the Session business model goes is that it will be a freemium type model. So this is something that's been very successful for Telegram. Telegram has Telegram Premium, which is essentially a subscription service for $4.99 a month. And that offers you a bunch of additional features in Telegram, whether that be larger group chats, increased file uploads, more profile customizability. And that's usually really attractive to Telegram Pro users or like the power users of Telegram. So it's like maybe 1 to 3% of Telegram users actually subscribe to the premium option. In Session, it's probably going to be quite similar. So you're going to have what's called Session Pro, which is a subscription service. You get larger file uploads, more profile customizability, larger groups, etc. And then the value that's created from that essentially is the value that's used to pay the network for operating, the storage and routing services. So these decentralized operators that are all around the world, they essentially are able to get the value that's created there and use that to cover their costs for operating their nodes. So that's the long-term idea. We always want Session to be free. If people don't want to pay, they don't have to. It's just about offering something to power users who want those additional features, and then that subsidizes basically the rest of the free users that use the network.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and I've seen that kind of freemium model used in a lot of different ways, and I think it can be very effective as long as those who are power users. And this is something I'd say to anybody that loves a platform or a product that they've used forever that is kind of this freemium model. If you are a power user to that, then support whatever that product is, even if it's a small bit. I know that every little bit like that really helps. When we're dealing with, especially messaging, where in order to use this, I'm downloading an app on my device and I am using a mobile network or I'm using a Wi-Fi network. What are the risks and what do I need to be concerned about? Or is there a concern of, okay, I'm using Session, but I'm doing it on an Android device or I'm doing it on an Apple device. And so there's still some kind of security or privacy risk because I'm doing it on their platform or because I'm sending it over this Wi-Fi network that's a public Wi-Fi network. Or does the encryption and what you do through that app negate any of those risks?
So on the network side, a lot of the risks are mitigated from the use of onion routing and the use of end-to-end encryption. So even if you're using a public Wi-Fi network, you're still encrypting all of the messages locally on the device before it's sent over the network. So if someone was sniffing a public Wi-Fi network, they wouldn't be able to see the contents of the messages. The only thing that they would be able to see is that you are connecting to Session, and the first hop in your route in the Session network, you're connecting to that. On the operating system side, there's a lot more surface area for attacks. So if you're using Android and your Android operating system is compromised, then there's not really so much that you can do as an app developer in that case, because if the device itself is compromised, then the
Yeah,
attacker is usually able to like screen record everything that's happening or log your keystrokes, and then they'll be able to send or they'll be able to see the messages that you're sending before they're being end-to-end encrypted, or even if they're being end-to-end encrypted, like they're still on the screen itself. You're sending these
sure.
messages, right?
Yeah.
So that's like typically not something that we focus on as a software developer, because it if you want to like create the entire stack from operating system all the way down to like hardware device, like that would be very expensive. Like we would need to release our own hardware, we'd need to release our own OS.
Yeah.
Luckily, there's a lot of people working at different layers of the stack, working on privacy. So you've got open source operating systems like Graphene OS,
Hmm.
which are very focused on security. You've got open source hardware, Android developers who are focusing on how to make the hardware itself as secure as possible. So yeah, we're really kind of focused on the application and kind of networking stack a little bit further up in the pile.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been testing out a Graphene OS phone now for a few months and just kind of seeing how that goes. And so what I hear you saying is it's like, okay, like the more you can control that stack on your own, because that's really a user's preference as opposed to, like you said, if Session were to try to do this on its own, it would be a monumental task to try to take on that entire stack. But if I'm using something like Graphene OS on a flash device, and then messaging through Session or Signal or Threema or one of these other encrypted messaging platforms, it's not that it's 100% like foolproof, secure. Like there's still the possibility of user error, I guess, for lack of a better word. But like controlling that stack sounds to be, just one way that you can mitigate as many of the risks as possible. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of this is also going to depend on what your threat model is.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to understand what your threat model is as well. So, are you like, is your ex trying to stalk you? Like,
Yeah.
that's one threat model versus, oh, I'm a kind of nation state spy that's trying
Yeah.
to avoid the US government compromising me. So, those are a lot different threat models. Like, the person who's trying to avoid a stalker, they're not dealing with someone with the resources and capabilities of the NSA, for example. if you're, a whistleblower against the US government, then you may be dealing with the resources of the NSA. And that is a much harder threat model to protect against.
Yeah.
And kind of is something that, all of the protections that Session provides, it provides to everyone. But there's something that, onion routing, for example, doesn't really work in the case where you have a global passive adversary, someone who's able to monitor the entire internet and see both the entry points and the exit points of the onion routing network.
Hmm.
That's the same case in Tor as well, which is a popular onion routing tool. So you really need to consider your threat model and decide and then look at the design of different messaging applications and see which one is best suited for you.
Yeah. Well, in just a moment, I'm going to be talking with Kee about, about asking him about government regulation, especially I know the last month there was all this stuff about the UK and privacy and encryption. But before we get into that, I did want to thank our sponsor for this live stream, which is DeleteMe. You guys know I've been working with DeleteMe for a number of years now. I've witnessed my own data being sold online, and I've had to deal with my own parents and my wife having their data sold. We're talking about email, phone numbers, addresses. This is just, if you can imagine what you can do on a platform like Facebook, when you want to go and create a targeted group, you can do that same thing with people's address. I want to grab a group of people in the Dallas area that are between the ages of 30 and 40 and just buy that list and start marketing to them. And if you want to be able to get out of something like that, there are a lot of different ways you can do it. You can do it manually. You can go through and make requests on something like White Pages or I don't even remember there's hundreds, if not thousands of these places. But saving me time is, using DeleteMe is one of the value propositions. And that's one of the reasons why I've used them for so many years. So if you want to have them go and find and remove your data and then continually monitor so that they don't add your data back in, which is always a possibility, then you can go to joindeleteme.com/allthingssecured. You'll get 20% off there, and you'll get the peace of mind that, you're having your data removed on a regular basis. You'll get reports on a monthly or quarterly basis, depending on your plan. And that allows you to just know that you're getting your data removed. So again, joindeleteme.com/allthingssecured. Thank you to them for allowing us to continue doing these live streams and have these great conversations with people like Kee Jeffreys. All right. So Kee, I don't know if it was last month or January when the news about the UK broke, where they essentially forced Apple's hand. And I think there's still some lawsuits back and forth and all this, but forced Apple's hand in removing the encryption on iCloud, right? So, I mean, just one piece of it. And I know that doesn't necessarily affect messaging platforms per se, but how much is government regulation and oversight something that should be a concern for users, especially as we consider communication between, our family, our friends, or even corporately?
I think it's a massive concern for users. We're seeing governments more and more come into the encryption space and demand that either end-to-end encryption be disabled or that they have backdoors into end-to-end encryption. And I think it's it's something that's very misunderstood by governments as well, because as soon as you create a backdoor for yourself as the government, you're also creating a backdoor which can be exploited by other governments. So
Sure.
governments that are trying to exploit users' data. So say, for example, in the UK, there's a lot of Chinese hacking that goes on, Russian hacking efforts that go on. You create these backdoors. They're not only usable by yourself, but they're also usable by the Chinese government. They can compromise those keys, which are used to read people's messages, the Russian government. So I think it's a very misguided effort to, try to disable end-to-end encryption or at least have a backdoor because they're not kind of seeing the full impact of that long term. And I think that's one of the more concerning things that is going on right now.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So then as a user, and by the way, I've been getting some messages from people. Is this live? Yes, we're live. I'm here in Thailand. Kee is in Australia. And so as you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will be getting to those in just a couple minutes. Um, a lot of times when we're dealing with stuff like Session or other apps, I think the biggest concern is adoption among your network, right? Is that because I can go download Session, but in order for this to really work, I'm going to have to convince my dad and my mom and my wife to download Session as well. Now, obviously, that network effect plays to, that's a good thing for Session, but that also means that it requires, it requires a lot in order for somebody to start using these services. So, do you have any thoughts or even suggestions for people that are wanting to get into more private communication, but maybe that barrier is a little high, or at least it feels high when someone's approaching it and going, "Oh my goodness, so now I've got to like get somebody else to download this as well." Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the biggest things which people struggle with moving over to more private services is getting people onboarded, like their friends and family onboarded, so that they can use those services as well with them. I'd say like dip your toe in first.
Mm,
You don't have to use Session every day, but one of the ways that I've heard people using it, where they kind of dip their toe in, is if they're sharing any private information over messaging clients. So,
yeah,
say for example, you need to share a password to something, or you need to share some personal information about yourself. Maybe that's something that you want to share over Session. So, you get your friends and family on, and then you share that information via Session, and then you kind of, as you get used to the experience of using Session, you slowly move more and more of your chats over to Session instead of just like dumping the whole thing on people and saying, this is the only place you can message me. Everyone has to download Session, because that can
yeah,
kind of be overwhelming at first.
yeah.
Sometimes it's just an approach of like dipping your toe in, seeing how the messaging application works, and then going further and further as you want to seek more privacy in your everyday conversations as well.
Yeah. How would you describe the difference? Because I mean, in my mind, and there could be more that I'm just not even aware of. Like when it comes to encrypted communication, three big names come to mind. You've got Session, you've got Signal, and then Threema. I may be missing some here, but like for me, those are the kind of the big three. How would you describe the difference between how those either operate or encrypt messages, or are they very much similar and it's just a preference thing? What are we dealing with?
So there's a few core differences between Session and, say Threema and Signal. I usually like list them from like one to three. So the first one being Session doesn't require a phone number to sign up. So that immediately makes it different from Signal. Threema doesn't require a phone number to sign up as well. I think they have an email address. You can put an email address in if you want, optionally. But Threema is also a paid application, so you need to pay, I think, $4.99 to download the application for the first time and install it. Session is free, so that lowers the barrier to entry a lot on the onboarding side of things. The second one, which makes Session different from the two other apps there, is that it uses a decentralized network instead of a centralized network of servers. So both Threema and Signal have central servers where you send
Mm,
messages to those central servers. They're then relayed to the other nodes, or to the users in the network. So there's a lot of
yeah,
metadata which is able to be collected by running those central servers in the network. And then the third thing is Session uses onion routing natively. So when you download Session, you don't have to tweak any configuration options or do anything like that. You're just using onion routing out of the gate. And Threema and Signal don't use any onion routing by default. You can turn on a VPN or use an onion router on your phone or your desktop, but that's something that you actually have to kind of download and install separately and then configure the application to use that. So those are the three things that I typically look at when comparing Session to other messaging applications.
yeah. That's really helpful to understand. I've got a couple of like quick questions, especially about corporate communication. But before I get into that, I wanted to just say to anybody that is watching this right now, if you want to go ahead and start asking questions that you have for Kee or myself I already see there's a chat going on, which is awesome. Josh, it's good to see you back in here again. It's been a little while. So if you have some questions that you think, things that I haven't necessarily covered, go ahead and start putting that in right now so that I'll have something ready whenever we get into that Q&A session. But for now, I've got a small business. It's not, I don't have hundreds of employees. I just have a few. But the way that we communicate, sometimes I'll be honest, is I've got one employee that's like through WhatsApp, and then I've got one that, that is in, just iMessage. How much should businesses be thinking about their corporate communication? Like either centralizing it or even using some kind of private messaging platform. Is that, I guess we're still talking about threat model here, small business versus big corporate entity, but what are the things that are considered here?
Yeah, I think, and as you said, like it comes back to the threat model that you're dealing with. If you're a convenience store and you're communicating with your employees about their roster or like the shifts that they're on, that's probably not as sensitive communications as if you're dealing in a hospital or in a doctor's office with people's personal sensitive medical information, for example. So those two different types of threat models are going to inform like which messaging application you use. I'd say like from an efficiency and like productivity standpoint, it is nice to have everyone in a group chat or everyone on the same platform, so you can create groups of people or be able to message people consistently on the same platform. And that's where a lot of people go and use like MS Teams or Slack or one of these kind of more work-based messaging applications. I'd say like Session is a bit more focused on, say, like the kind of consumer messaging market. So similar market to Signal, people messaging each other, friends and family. Enterprise is very interesting for us, but there's like a little bit more kind of compliance overhead that sometimes comes with that. So, even though Session, I think, is like a very good application to share very private data. So like health information, for example, I'd be much more confident sharing that on Session than I would be on WhatsApp. There's like this kind of compliance overhead, at least in the US, with like HIPAA compliance. So your messaging application has to be HIPAA compliant.
Yeah.
And actually, a lot of the HIPAA compliance rules go against privacy to a certain extent. So they require you have these like audit logs of like, when users access particular data, which creates like a metadata log that you're keeping behind. So that's potentially some way incompatible with what Session does, which is try to reduce metadata as much as possible. So I think Session can be used in an enterprise context, but it's not necessarily it doesn't have the certification to be used at a lot of those levels yet.
Yeah. All right. I'd love to maybe see if we can pull in some questions here. This wasn't necessarily a question, but I thought it was kind of funny. Shuttleco, I don't know how to say it. Let me see if I can add this to our broadcast here, what that would look like. He says the safest messaging method is paper and pen. Bob writes a message, hand delivers it to Sally. Sally reads it and then immediately burns it. Everything else is less secure. Is that true? Like I always feel so like I don't know, like there's this extremist view of like, well, if you do it online, screw it, you're done. Like, is that really true, or is that just a cop out for people that just don't want to work towards more privacy and security?
I think it's a bit of both, to be honest, and also kind of comes back to your threat model. So, if you are a whistleblower and you're dealing with the US government, the US government can, to a certain extent, like compromise every device like on the planet. They have these backdoors that they've built in, and some of these came out in the PRISM program that the NSA was using to collect people's metadata, but then also like insert backdoors into hardware, work with device manufacturers to have backdoors into people's phones. So if you are dealing with a very high level state actor, it is often the best way that you're going to be able to combat these things is to go back to physical means. Either having a conversation in real life,
Yeah.
writing something down on a piece of paper and giving that to someone instead of using the internet. But most people are not facing that threat model. They might be facing a threat model where they're dealing with corporate surveillance. So, someone wants to advertise to them and they don't want to be caught up in that like dragnet of,
Yeah.
advertising data collection. And in that case, like session offers a lot, which is very hard to compromise if you're just kind of an advertiser in the space, or you're, collecting data from that perspective, or if you're trying to avoid a stalker, for example. Like there's a lot less that they have access to, and session offers a lot of protections there that are very useful in that context. So it's comes down to your threat model. You always have to consider, like, to what extent can you be compromised, and the actors that you're actually dealing with.
Yeah. I, one of the things that I've kind of personally noticed is people in general, and I wouldn't necessarily, it's not always the tech savvy people, but people in general tend to overestimate the abilities of the average, like, disgruntled ex, or like what they could do to their phone. Because I'll get emails from people that are like, I'm pretty sure my ex is just spying on everything that I'm doing. It's like, that would be really hard for some, like, the average person to do. And then we also overestimate our importance in the level of in the eyes of state governments. Like the average person is not being pursued by a state government. I wouldn't say, like, I don't know, maybe that's an overgeneralization, but I think that there's still a lot that we can do that that isn't like that the threat model of that state actor doesn't necessarily apply to the most of us. Guys, I know you've got questions. You've got to be doing, but you got to do better than this. I'm going to go ahead and ask one more of mine as I wait for some other questions to come in. You explained how we go from like end to end, where we've got, one person communicating with one person through a decentralized network using the Onion, protocol. So how does that work with a group chat and maintain that privacy when now you've got multiple people accessing the same chat?
Yeah. So the way that it works in session is, there's this idea in a one-to-one chat that, each user has their own swarm, and that's where the messages are stored for that user. So when you're sending a message to a user, you go and deposit it on one of the nodes in the swarm, and that node then, replicates it across the rest of the nodes in the swarm. In the case of group messaging, what happens is the group creator essentially defines a key that they create at the start, and that then defines the swarm which all of the messages for the group will be stored on. So
Okay.
everyone sends the messages to that swarm, and then in terms of the encryption key, the admin creates the encryption key and then shares that with the members in the group. And then when someone leaves the group or is kicked from the group, the encryption key is rotated,
Yeah.
such that messages that are new messages that are encrypted for the group can't be read by users that have been kicked from the group. And then those keys that are rotated are then reshared with the members that are still part of the group. So yeah, essentially there's this like rotation process, and then there's also like this definition of like, okay, there's a swarm in the network which all of the messages for the group get stored on.
Okay. That's interesting. I'm going to pull this question up from Tommy and see if it can be read here. But he says, do you have anything to say about Signal and the current question about a Russian connection? Now, I'm going to alter this question a little bit, Kee, just because I think maybe a more interesting way to say this would be, I've heard people talk about, okay, the Onion protocol was developed by the CIA, so you can't trust, that. Or Telegram has a connection with Russia because of its founder. And I've heard the same thing with Signal. How much concern should there be about government intervention or government, I don't know, oversight into these platforms? Like, is that a concern?
I'd say like on the protocol level, there shouldn't be too much concern. So if your concern is like, oh, there's a backdoor in the Signal protocol, which is the protocol which is used for end-to-end encrypting messages in Signal, I would say that shouldn't be your highest level of concern. And the main reason there is The Signal protocol is completely open source. The Signal app is also completely open source. So you can actually go and audit the code, which is in Signal, and see that it's doing what it says that it's doing. It's actually end-to-end encrypting messages. And that's been audited by a bunch of open source actors, also by like professional security firms as well. On the server side, though, like Signal has these centralized servers in the network which are able to see a lot of metadata. I would say there should be like a fairly high level of concern on that side of things, because even if Signal themselves aren't, collecting that metadata, just by having that centralized server, if someone hacks into that centralized server, they see a lot of information that's flowing through the server itself. So it doesn't even have to be that Signal's a bad actor. If someone gets access to their centralized servers, they can see, okay, this IP address connected to this server at this time and sent this message, and then it was requested by this IP address at this time. So then you can form a connection between users on the metadata side. Signal also uses phone numbers as well. So that's another thing that you can kind of connect in a way to a user's public key and then their messages. And that's all handled on a centralized server. So what Session does is that it doesn't run the servers itself. So if you to ask me, for a user's metadata or a user's data, I wouldn't be able to give that to you, because we don't actually run the servers in the network. It's run by these community operators, which are all around the world and which are incentivized. So you'd actually need to go to the community operators and request data from them. And even then, it's end-to-end encrypted, and there isn't that personal information like IP addresses and phone numbers attached to messages as well. So I'd be concerned more about the centralized server component rather than the underlying protocols themselves.
Yeah, very interesting. All right. Well, before we ask the last couple questions, I just wanted to say again a thank you both to Kee for his time, and also to DeleteMe for making this live stream possible. If you are at all interested in making sure that you remove your personal information online, go to joindeleteme.com/allthingssecured. Okay, this question comes in, and I assume this is from maybe people in your group of people, but what improvements are on Session's roadmap? Will you ever re-implement perfect forward secrecy? This is from Joseph Brennan.
Yeah. So some of the things that we're working on right now are improvements to calls. So Session has voice and video calls. They haven't been the most stable over the last couple of years. They're kind of in a beta state, and we've been improving those massively. We have also just rolled out a new version of groups. So that's groups that support up to 100 people. We've just re-implemented the protocol there to make it way more reliable, and just have less bugs when you're adding and removing users, which was previously quite a large problem. Just with some users, basically when a user was kicked, they wouldn't get the new key, so they wouldn't be able to read new messages. So that was a major issue, and Groups v2 kind of majorly improves that. So those are some of the things on the roadmap. In terms of perfect forward secrecy, it's very difficult to combine with a decentralized network that we have, just because there isn't the same kind of level of message ordering guarantees. And then also like you have issues with storage as well. So Session deletes messages off the network of nodes, which stores the messages every 14 days. So if there's a key rotation that happens with perfect forward secrecy with something like the Signal protocol, and then you were offline for a period of a couple of or 14 days, you're not going to get that key rotation, which means that new messages that the user sends to you, you won't be able to decrypt. So that's like one of the issues. There's also like issues with sharing of pre-key bundles. All of this is to say it's a very tricky technical problem to solve. But I do think that the properties that perfect forward secrecy provides are like advantageous in some use cases. And I would like to see Session get further towards something which is perfect forward secrecy, like where you are rotating keys semi-regularly, so you do get some of the protections there. It's just about how to implement that technically without giving up some of the guarantees that you'll always be able to receive messages which you can decrypt, and that you're not losing messages, because that's previously an issue that we had back in 2019 and 2020 with perfect code secrecy using the Signal protocol. So I do think it would be something that would be good to re-implement, but it's just like how we do that in the proper manner.
Yeah. And I think you might have actually answered this in the process of answering that question, but I want to address this directly. Are the messages stored? This is from Matt Davies. Are the messages stored in the blockchain? And if so, how does the disappearing messages work?
No, so messages are not stored on the blockchain itself. The blockchain is just acting as the incentive layer for the node network. The issue with storing them in the blockchain is, typically things that are stored in the blockchain are stored there forever. So you would have this essentially infinitely growing chain of messages that every node would have to store, which would become very, costly from a storage perspective over time. And then also, like, from a metadata or from a data perspective, it's not good to have messages be persisted forever. It's better to delete them progressively so that they can't be recovered at a later point. So no, we don't store messages on the blockchain itself. In terms of disappearing messages, Session does have disappearing messages. We have two different options: delete after send and delete after read. And those have various like timer options as well, which you can set. So delete after read, I think the lowest timer is 5 minutes and the highest timer is 2 weeks. And delete after send, I think it's 1 day and 2 weeks. There's various options in between those. The way that those work is essentially by telling the swarm that you're storing your messages on to delete this message after this amount of time instead of the default 14 days. So if you set it to 5 minutes, the server will delete it after 5 minutes instead of waiting the full 14 days to delete it.
Yeah. So thank you for that. That's a great answer. This next question, I haven't dug into this news, but I know this is pretty breaking news in the past couple of days, or maybe even the past 24 hours. How can government officials better protect sensitive military communications after someone added a journalist to a group chat? I think it was in the U.S. government, and I just read this. I did not go deep into it, so I don't know all the details. But it was, at least according to the news source that I read, a major security vulnerability. I don't even know how to go about asking or getting an answer about that question, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a bit tricky because, if the administrator of the group has permissions to add new users into the actual group chat, then they add a journalist into the group chat. That's something which is tricky to prevent because they're the administrator of the group. I mean, you can think of some interesting protocols here. First thing, like trying to limit the amount of information that someone new who joins the group gets. So limiting the ability to see historic messages, for example, could be interesting. And that's something that Session is going to offer in groups in the future as well. Is like when you invite someone to the group, you can decide whether they want to see historic messages or just the new messages which are sent in the group. Another thing you could think about is, okay, maybe you have a setting in the group which requires, say, a majority of the group members to have to approve someone before they're able to join the group chat. That would, maybe you could turn that mode on because it's not the best, like if, someone's offline and then they have to approve. But if you use this majority system, maybe not everyone has to be online and they kind of, you have this manual approval process. That would also be interesting. I think those are probably the two ways that you would think about addressing something like that.
Yeah, but that would have to be on a platform level. That's not something that I mean, I guess you kind of implement some kind of, within your office or White House in this case, protocol, but like that's not something that Signal could just spin up, those two features, or is it?
I actually think it is something that Signal or Session could spin up. The way that it would work is like, the admin would kind of invite someone into the group, but into like a holding area. And then the other users in the group would then have to go to that holding area and then approve that user. And maybe there's a notification that comes through like, the admin invited this new user, like, do you want to approve them or not? And then you would like approve. And then when it reaches some sort of super majority, that then allows the admin to be able to, give them read access to the group, for example, or write access to the group. So it is something that could be done. It's a fairly complicated feature though. And maybe the better way to think about this is just like there is some implicit trust in the group admin. So just make sure that that person is like a trusted person.
Yeah. Well, everybody, and I'll get to you, Kee, in a second. Everybody, thank you for joining us. I am just again grateful to Kee for spending some time with us, as well as to DeleteMe for sponsoring this live stream, making it possible. Go to joindeleteme.com/allthingssecured, where you can check out the special discount that they've offered to everybody here in the All Things Secured community. Makes these type of conversations possible. And these are really fun for me because I'm learning a lot, even just talking with Kee. I couldn't create what Kee has been able to create. And so there's a lot that I can draw from his expertise and his experience. And so I'm really grateful for his time. Kee, I'm going to bring you on one more time just to ask you, if somebody wants to try out Session, can you give the website and what should they be searching for on the App Store? Where should they go?
Yeah, so Session's available in all of the app stores, so Google Play, Apple, F-Droid, also on desktop as well, Mac, Linux, and Windows. So if you want to download the application, all of the links are on getsession.org, and you could just Google or search Session as well. It'll be the first thing that comes up, and you'll be able to find us there. So yeah, I encourage you to download the application, maybe dip your toe in and test it out a little bit. And see how it goes for you. But I think like Session is really focused on making the application as user-friendly as possible. So there aren't a lot of technical hoops to jump through to get started on Session. I think you'll find the onboarding experience to be pretty easy. So yeah, look forward to seeing some of your audience on Session.